In 1980, the three most valuable chip companies on Earth were all Japanese. NEC was number 1, Hitachi was number 2, Toshiba was number 3. 6 of the top 10 semiconductor companies in the world were Japanese. Japan controlled roughly half of global chip production, and its DRAM memory chips were so reliable, so consistent, that American manufacturers were buying them by the pallet.
Then Japan lost it all. By 2008, Japan's global semiconductor market share had fallen below 10%. The companies that once dominated the rankings had merged, shrunk, or quietly exited the business. The engineers who built those fabs had retired. The institutional knowledge had evaporated.
For 3 decades, Japan watched from the sidelines as Taiwan, South Korea, and eventually China built the chip industry Japan had once owned.
But here's what happened in February 6 on a plot of land in Kumamoto, on Japan's southern island of Kyushu. In front of Toyota chairman Akio Toyoda, Sony Group CEO Kenichiro Yoshida, and a delegation of Japanese government ministers, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the world's most powerful chip maker, cut the ribbon on its first Japanese factory.
It was the most symbolically loaded ceremony in Japanese industrial history in a generation, and it was just the beginning.
To understand why Japan lost its chip dominance, you have to understand how it got there in the first place.
In the 1970s, Japan had almost no advanced semiconductor industry. The country imported chips from the United States, primarily from companies like Texas Instruments and Intel. Japanese electronics manufacturers, Sony, Hitachi, Fujitsu, were entirely dependent on foreign suppliers for the brains of their products.
METI, Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, decided this was unacceptable. In 1976, they launched the Buiei Technology Research Association, a government-backed consortium that pooled R&D resources from NEC, Hitachi, Fujitsu, Toshiba and Mitsubishi Electric. The goal was simple: beat America at its own game.
They did. By the early 1980s, Japanese DRAM chips had a defect rate that was a fraction of their American competitors. Japanese fabs produced chips with yields that American engineers couldn't match. According to the Brookings Institution, Japan's share of global semiconductor sales skyrocketed from about 15% in the early 1970s to roughly 50% by the mid-1980s, overtaking the United States entirely.
American chip companies were terrified. Intel, which had invented the DRM in 1960, exited the DRM business in 1980 because it simply could not compete with Japanese pricing and quality. The U.S. government launched trade investigations. Japan signed a semiconductor trade arrangement in 1980, agreeing to set minimum prices on chips sold to the U.S. The trade war was real and it was vicious.
But Japan's dominance didn't collapse because of American trade pressure. It collapsed because Japan missed the next wave. The personal computer revolution shifted semiconductor demand from memory chips to logic chips, the processors, controllers, and application-specific designs that power modern computing. It also birthed a new business model, the fabless foundry split. Companies like Qualcomm would design chips without manufacturing them. TSMC, founded in Taiwan in 1980, would manufacture chips without designing them.
Japan's chip companies were vertically integrated behemoths. They designed, manufactured, and sold their own chips, mainly to themselves. They were optimized for a world that no longer existed. As Japan's economic bubble burst in the early 1990s, the financial resources that had sustained the semiconductor investments dried up. The companies cut R&D, engineers retired and weren't replaced. Japan fell behind node by node, year by year.
By Japan's global share had dropped below 10%. The country that invented itself into the chip business had allowed itself to be designed out of it.
The wake-up call, when it finally came, was not subtle. In Arsage a global chip shortage ground automotive production lines to a halt. Toyota, the world's largest automaker, cut production targets by 400,000 vehicles because it couldn't get enough semiconductors. The chips in question were not cutting edge. They were the kind of mature, reliable microcontrollers that go into steering systems, power windows, and engine management units. But Japan's car companies discovered they had become almost entirely dependent on chips made in Taiwan, South Korea, and China. Then came the geopolitical pressure. In METI and Russia's invasion of Ukraine demonstrated that supply chains everyone had assumed were permanent could be severed overnight. Taiwan, where TSMC fabricates over 90% of the world's most advanced chips, sits 90 miles from mainland China. Japanese security planners did not need to run a simulation to understand the implications.
There was also the AI factor. The explosion of demand for AI computing starting in 2019 revealed just how completely Japan had missed the most important technology transition since the internet. Nvidia, the American chipmaker whose products power the AI revolution, relies on TSMC for its most advanced processors. Japan was a spectator.
METI published a white paper laying out the stakes in terms that were unusually direct for Japanese bureaucratic language. Semiconductors were no longer just industrial goods, they were national security infrastructure, and Japan's dependency on foreign suppliers was a strategic vulnerability of the first order.
The response was a plan of remarkable ambition and remarkable cost. Japan's chip comeback strategy has two distinct pillars.
The first is what you might call the anchor strategy: attract the world's best chip makers to build fabs in Japan, securing supply chain proximity for Japanese customers like Sony, Toyota, and Denso, while rebuilding domestic manufacturing capability.
The centerpiece is TSMC's investment in Kumamoto. TSMC's first Japanese factory, formerly known as Japan Advanced Semiconductor Manufacturing, or JASM, opened in February 2010. The fab produces chips ranging from 12 to 28 nanometers, the kind used in automotive electronics, image sensors, and industrial equipment. Sony Semiconductor Solutions, which provides the image sensors in most of the world's smartphone cameras, is the anchor customer. Denso, Toyota's primary electronics supplier, takes automotive chips. By late 2010, JASM had begun mass production at a monthly capacity of around 55,000 wafers, well below a full-scale fab, but enough to establish the supply relationship.
The bigger news came in early 2010. TSMC's second Kumamoto factory, still under construction next to the first, was upgraded from a planned 6-nanometer process to 3 nanometers, the same leading-edge node TSMC uses in its most advanced facilities. According to Digitimes, TSMC confirmed the 3-nanometer upgrade in February 2010, with total investment rising to approximately Rn mass production expected around 2010. The Kumamoto plant will produce approximately 15,000 wafers per month at 3-nanometer, functioning as overflow capacity for TSMC's primary fabs in Taiwan while serving Japanese customers who need the most advanced node available in country. TSMC's total committed investment in Japan is now more than $20 billion. From zero in Nissan to the world's most advanced chipmaker's second largest overseas presence in less than a decade. By some estimates, TSMC's overseas output will account for 20% of total production by Nissan, with Japan and Arizona as the two anchors.
But anchoring foreign production in Japan, while valuable, is not the same as rebuilding Japanese chip leadership. That's where the second pillar comes in, and it is considerably more audacious.
Rapidus was founded in Nissan. Its founding shareholders read like a who's who of Japanese industry: Toyota, Sony, NTT, SoftBank, Denso, NEC, Kioxia, and Mitsubishi UFJ Bank. The company has one stated goal: build Japan's first domestic 2-nanometer semiconductor foundry by Nissan Tentian.
If you find that timeline aggressive, you are not alone. Rapidus was essentially starting from scratch in a technology domain that requires decades of process development. 2-nanometer chips represent the current frontier of semiconductor manufacturing. Only TSMC and Samsung have announced plans to produce them at scale. Rapidus, a company that didn't exist 3 years ago, is attempting to compete at this node.
The skepticism in the industry was immediate. Omdia principal analyst Manoj Sukumaran said publicly that Rapidus would not be a serious competitor to TSMC in the near term. The Register described the project as Japan's most expensive gamble in industrial history.
And yet the milestones keep coming. Rapidus partnered with IBM Research, which had developed 2-nanometer gate-all-around transistor technology at its Albany facility. IBM dispatched approximately 10 engineers to Rapidus's factory in Chitose, Hokkaido, a city best known for its proximity to ski resorts, to transfer manufacturing knowledge directly. According to IBM Research's own blog, researchers successfully transferred key elements of 2-nanometer technology to the Chitose facility.
The Hokkaido factory, called IIM-1, activated its cleanroom in Nissan and installed extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment, the same technology used to print the world's most advanced chips. Test wafers began running through a 2-nanometer gate-all-around process in mid-2 beat-dan by late Nissan Rapidus, demonstrated functional 2-nanometer transistors to potential customers at a private event.
In February, Rapidus closed a funding round of $15 billion, roughly $10 billion at current exchange rates, from the Japanese government's Information Technology Promotion Agency and 32 private companies including Canon, Fujitsu, NTT, and SoftBank. According to the Japan Times, Japan has pledged to inject over 1 trillion yen into Rapidus between Ni Tankli and Ni-10 Dirn Lopi and NITI's broader semiconductor and AE budget, which Japan quadrupled to approximately Ni-san trillion yen, about Nunna-Q billion for fiscal year Ni-10
This is not a token investment. This is a national industrial policy decision of the kind Japan hasn't made since the original Buierisai project of the 1970s.
By March, according to TrendForce, 60 companies were in active discussions with Rapidus as potential customers. 10 had received preliminary pricing quotes. The company is now targeting not just 2 nanometers but 1 nanometer, with a stated goal of narrowing the gap with TSMC to just 6 months on advanced node development.
Audacious? Absolutely. Impossible? That's a harder question than it was 2 years ago. Here's the thing that most Western coverage of Japan's semiconductor comeback misses entirely.
Everyone focuses on Rapidus and TSMC because those are the dramatic stories, the billion-dollar bets, the ribbon-cutting ceremonies, the race to 2 nanometers. But Japan has never actually left the semiconductor industry, it just left the part of the industry that's visible.
While Japan's chip fabs were losing market share through the 1990s and 2000s, Japanese companies quietly became dominant in the parts of the supply chain that nobody talks about until they're missing.
Shin-Etsu Chemical and SUMC altogether control more than 50% of the global market for silicon wafers, the physical substrate on which every chip is built. If you make a semiconductor, you almost certainly need a Japanese silicon wafer.
For photoresist, the light-sensitive chemical coating that transfers circuit patterns onto chips, Japanese companies including Shin-Etsu, JSR, Tokyo Oka Kogyo, and Fujifilm Electronics Materials control roughly 90% of the global market for advanced photoresist types. Every leading-edge fab in the world, including TSMC, Samsung, and Intel, depends on Japanese photoresist.
Japanese companies hold over 50% global market share in 14 of the most critical materials used in chip making: specialty gases, polishing slurries, photomasks, packaging substrates. In category after category, you find a Japanese company sitting quietly at the top of the supply chain.
Then there's equipment. Tokyo Electron is the world's third largest semiconductor equipment company. Advantis dominates the chip testing market. Japanese firms hold approximately 88% of the global market for the coder and developer machines that apply photoresist to wafers, a step that happens in every advanced fab on Earth.
In a Marseille analysis by the Asia-Pacific finance body AMRLU, researchers noted that Japan controls a uniquely resilient position in the global chip supply chain precisely because of this materials and equipment dominance. Even during the period when Japan's own fabs were declining, the global chip industry was becoming more dependent on Japanese inputs.
This is the strategic context in which TSMC chose Kumamoto, and it's the strategic context in which Rapidus makes sense. Japan is not trying to rebuild a chip industry from nothing. It is trying to reconnect a manufacturing layer, the fab, to an existing ecosystem of materials, equipment, and deep process chemistry that never went away.
There is one more factor shaping Japan's semiconductor urgency that deserves direct attention: the geopolitical pressure from Washington. In January 2020, the Trump administration imposed 25% Section A Sanzir tariffs on imports of advanced semiconductors into the United States. The executive order, signed on January 14, took effect the following day. For Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, countries that collectively produce the vast majority of the world's chips, the tariffs created immediate uncertainty about export economics.
The U.S. Commerce Department indicated that framework agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan could reduce tariff exposure in exchange for commitments to build chip capacity in the United States. The negotiations were still ongoing as of April 2020, but the broader message from Washington was unambiguous: if you want access to the American market, you need to have skin in the American manufacturing game.
For Japan, this created a peculiar dynamic. The U.S. tariff pressure accelerated Japanese investment in U.S.-aligned supply chains, which in practice means deepening the TSMC and Rapidus relationships, since both projects depend on American technology and align with U.S. strategic interests. The threat of tariffs, paradoxically, became a further argument for Japan's semiconductor investment strategy.
Japan's government announced in early 2020 that it was also considering restrictions on photoresist exports to China, according to TrendForce. Japan's dominance in photoresists, combined with U.S. export control pressure on China, has turned materials policy into a new front in the semiconductor geopolitics Japan finds itself navigating. So here is where things stand. TSMC has brought Japan back into the leading edge of chip manufacturing, at least as a host country. JSM is producing chips in Kumamoto today. A3 Nomad factory is under construction. $20 billion of TSMC investment is anchored to Japanese soil.
Rapidus is moving faster than most industry observers expected. 2-nanometer test chips are running. 60 potential customers are in conversations. The Japanese government has committed over yen 1 trillion to making it work. The factory in Hokkaido is no longer a construction site. It is an operating, if nascent, foundry.
Japan's materials and equipment companies remain among the most strategically critical in the global supply chain, with competitive positions that have strengthened, not weakened, over the decades of manufacturing decline.
And METI has reorganized its industrial policy around semiconductors and AI in a way that echoes the original Bui Ellersai strategy: government coordination, targeted subsidy, and a willingness to play a long game. Whether Rapidus succeeds at mass 2-nanometer production by Ichwer an is genuinely uncertain. The timelines are aggressive. The technical challenges are real. TSMC has a decade head start and a manufacturing culture built over 30 years.
Nobody should pretend that a 3-year-old company is about to catch the world's most advanced chip maker.
But the more important question is not whether Rapidus matches TSMC on day one. The question is whether Japan, for the first time since the 1990s, has a domestic advanced logic foundry capable of serving Japanese customers on Japanese terms, on Japanese soil. Even a Rapidus that captures 5% of the advanced foundry market would transform Japan's strategic position in ways that the last 3 decades of materials and equipment dominance never could.
The real question now is not whether Japan can reclaim 50% of the global chip market. That is not the goal. The goal is strategic autonomy, the ability to produce the chips that Japan's most critical industries need without depending entirely on factories 90 miles from mainland China or fabs that could be swept up in a geopolitical crisis in the Taiwan Strait.
By that measure, Japan's bet looks considerably more rational than it might appear. There is a phrase in Japanese manufacturing culture, monozukuri, that translates roughly as the art and science of making things. It encompasses not just the physical act of production, but the entire ethos of craft, precision, and continuous improvement that Japanese manufacturers have built into their DNA over generations.
Japan's semiconductor fall was, at its core, a monozukuri failure. Not in the sense that Japanese engineers stopped caring about quality, the materials and equipment companies never did, but in the sense that Japan lost the conviction that making chips at the frontier was part of what Japan did. The fab, the physical place where circuits are etched onto silicon at scales smaller than a virus, stopped being something Japan believed it could own.
What TSMC's arrival in Kumamoto represents, and what Rapidus represents in its own more uncertain way, is a reclamation of that conviction, not a guarantee of success, not a return to Senyu Hakyu Loktain, but a decision made at the highest levels of Japanese government, industry, and finance, that making chips is part of Japan's identity again.
And if there's one thing the history of Japanese industry suggests, it's that when Japan decides something is part of its identity, it commits at a scale and over a time frame that most of its competitors are unwilling to match.
Japan once made 50% of the world's chips, then it lost everything. Now it wants it all back. Not all at once, not immediately, but with the patient, compounding, decades-long intensity that is, in the end, the Japan factor.